Once upon a time, in a land south of the border, when resident cards were green, the INM website was terrible. You could only pay your pago de derechos at a bank. The exchange rate was almost 21 pesos to the US dollar. And there were still paper FMM forms being given out. That's when I got my temporary residency in Mexico. And in this video, I'm going to tell you everything I needed as well as everything I did. Hey friend, my name is Aaliyah and the goal with this channel is to help make all things Mexico sound not so foreign to foreigners. As a foreigner myself who's moved to Mexico and had to figure everything out on her own, I know the struggle and I'm here to help. So if that sounds good to you, don't forget to subscribe. First up, everything I needed. The first thing I needed was the correct trámite or application already filled out and printed, as well as signed on the back. The specific name for my trámite was Cambio de condición a residente temporal por vínculo familiar con mexicano. I needed that specific trámite because being married to a Mexican, I didn't need to go to the consulate ahead of time, nor did I need to prove any financial requirements. I could come into Mexico as a visitor and leave as a resident, without the need for my FMM to say canje upon arrival. You too may qualify for that route if you have familial ties with a Mexican. If you're curious, check out a previous video I did on that topic. The next thing I needed was one of later two pago de derechos. So this first pago de derechos was strictly for the studying and the reception of my application. And the total was 1,410 Mexican pesos. In order to pay that pago de derechos, I had to go into a physical bank with my actual pago de derecho sheet already filled out, my passport, as well as the cash that I needed. Once it was my turn to go to the teller at the bank, I gave her all three of those documents. She printed out 2 receipts. She had me sign one, and she kept one. And my signature had to be as close to my passport as possible. Speaking of passports, the next thing I needed was a valid passport. That wasn't too difficult because I had to come into the country with a valid passport. The next thing I needed was my physical FMM form that I received upon entry into Mexico, which was also not hard to get at the time because they were handing them out like hotcakes at the airport in those days. The next thing I needed was my long form apostilled and translated birth certificate. I had to get it apostilled in the state where I was from prior to coming to Mexico. And then once I was in Mexico, I got it translated by an officially recognized translator in Mexico, also sometimes referred to as a perito. So for the appointment, in one hand, I had the apostilled version of my long form birth certificate, and in the other hand, I also had the translated version of my apostilled long form birth certificate. You will need both. Next, I had to prove the Mexicanicity of my husband. So I had to prove his Mexican citizenship. For that, I was over-prepared. I brought in his birth certificate, I brought in his INE, as well as his passport, 3 of the most common proofs of citizenship in Mexico. After indeed proving that he was a Mexican, I then had to prove my link with him. So I had to bring in an apostilled and translated version of our marriage certificate. So again, I had to get a marriage certificate apostilled in the States, and then when I came here, I had to get it translated. So I had an official translation, as well as the apostilled marriage certificate. 2 documents, they want them both. Next, I need a written attestation of our marriage together. It looked a little bit like this on the screen. I'll leave a link in the description portion of you can find it or a PDF to it. He had to sign it, and I also had to sign it. This is just Mexico's way of saying, yes, you guys are married, but are you still in a relationship? Next up, I needed a proof of address. It was very ironic. They were picky on the proof of address, but they weren't picky on the name that was on the proof of address. So I believe I brought in my CFE bill as well as my Telmex or internet bill. They didn't want the CFE electric bill for some reason, but they did accept the Telmex internet bill. And the bill was not in my name, but that didn't matter. And the bill was not in my name, but that did matter to them. Next up, I needed to pay Pago de Derecho number 2. And the cost for that one was 6,613 pesos. And that was for a 2-year residency visa. Next thing I needed, and please don't forget this, is the copies. Copies, copies, and more copies. Bring copies of your copies. Bring copies of your copies. Copy that? And also optional, but if you're a minor germaphobe like me, also bring a pen. Bring a black and a blue pen, just in case. I'll let you know more in part 2 why I say bring both colors. But you'll be signing a lot of paperwork. If you don't want to touch a pen that's been commonly touched by hundreds of people that day, bring a pen. Black and blue. Now that was everything I needed. So how do I put these puzzle pieces together? What was the actual process like? Well, after getting all of my paperwork together, the first thing I did was go to a bank to pay my pago de derecho. At that time, I only had access to the first pago de derecho. So I went to the bank, I paid that. They gave me my receipt. I filed that away because I would make copies of that later. The next morning, I got up bright and early and headed over to the INM office. It was maybe like 5 or 6 a.m. in the morning, and I was maybe third in line. At that time, you couldn't make appointments. It was just a first come, first served basis. And they just handed out a certain amount of tickets. And on that ticket, there was a number. So once the office opened, they let everyone in, and you formed another line. Based on your number, when it was your turn, they would call you up. You would show them your trámite, and then they would proceed to let you in. You would sign in. You would get into an inside line before going to the counter. Once you made it to the counter, if the person deemed that your trámite was incorrect or that you didn't qualify for that particular residency, they would then send you to the information counter, and it was sayonara. The information counter would then give you the correct application or trámite that you needed, and then tell you to return the next day with all the correct paperwork. But if your trámite was correct, the person behind the counter would then ask for you to hand them the papers in an organized fashion. The lady behind the counter wanted 2 separate piles of organized documents. One was the originals and one was the copies, but she wanted them in the same order. And that order was first the trámite, then the proof of payment, then the proof of all of my documents that I am who I say I am. Next was the proof of all of my husband's documents to prove that he was indeed a Mexican citizen. Next was the proof of our marriage or our connection. And then next was the proof of address. And the only special note here was because my husband was technically born in the States, but got his citizenship through his parents, his Mexican birth certificate still says United States of America or Estados Unidos de America. So when she saw his birth certificate and she saw that it said that he was born in the States on a Mexican birth certificate, she was like, I don't know. She didn't like that. And she said no. But then, because I'm always over-prepared, I gave her his passport and his INE. She couldn't deny that. So she accepted those 2 documents as his proof of Mexican citizenship. So once she approved of all of my documents and gave me the okay, she went and she printed out a document. And that document was called Comprobante de Registro de Solicitud. On that document, it will have an NUT number, which is a Número de Único Trámite. Número Único de Trámite or something along those lines, which is just a specific number that's assigned to your trámite. It also has your pieza number, your application type, as well as the person's name who was assisting you. She said that this paper would be useful if I wanted to reference my application after I left the office. I would just need that NUT number, she said, as well as the email that I used on the trámite to fill out the application. So with that document, she printed out 2 copies. She had me sign both of them, again, as closely to my passport as possible. She kept one, and then she gave me one. Also, with that document, she gave me 2 copies of my receipt for my first pago de derecho. She had me sign both copies. She kept one, and I kept one. On that stamp, it just said recibido or received, the date, as well as the INM logo. It was just a confirmation that they've received payment, and I acknowledged it. At this point, she then gave me all of my originals back and kept all of the copies. She then asked how many years I would like. I asked her, how many years can I get? And she said, 1, 2, 3, 4 years. So I'm thinking, the more the merrier, right? So I asked her, why shouldn't I get 4 years? And she said, she was very kind. She said, well, because you're married to a Mexican, after 2 years, you qualify for permanent residency. So I would just get 2 years. I said, say less, 2 years, please. She then went to print out a pago de derecho slip and tell me, go pay this, come back, and then come straight to this counter. So I immediately went outside with a small smile on my face, hurried and text my husband who was on standby and told him, I need you to go pay this pago de derecho. We didn't know there was going to be another payment. But as always, my husband came through. He came to where I was standing. I gave him the pago de derechos to pay. He went, he paid it, he got receipts, he made copies for me, and then he came back. Next, I went back into the office, got in the inside line again, went back to the counter. Thankfully, I got the same lady. I gave her my second pago de derechos with my copies, of course. So then she stamps 2 copies with recibido, the date, as well as the INM logo. She has me sign them both. She keeps one and she gives me one. And then she tells me I can go wait outside for my name to be called. So I go, I sit down. Once my name was called, I went back into the INM office, but this time I was going behind the counter to the special side. Once in the back, there were many different offices and cubicles set up to sit you down and to ask you a few questions. And the questions were all the questions in the formato básico. Then they took my photo, got my fingerprints, and they proceeded to print out a document called Acuse de recibido entregada de documento migratorio. They printed out 2 copies of that document, per usual. I had to sign them both. They gave me a copy and they kept a copy. The document was just an acknowledgement of my receipt of my immigration document or my residency card, and it had a preview of my actual residency card on it, and it showed me my photo, which I was like, ah! That document also, again, had that NUT number on it. And they had me go wait outside again until my residency card was ready. After a short while, they came out and they gave me a physical copy of my temporary resident card for 2 years. And I left a happy camper. 6 hours later, it took a total of 6 hours. I was so happy to get that card, but I was probably even more happy that I didn't have to return to the office for another 2 years. Many of you know that my first attempt to get residency was a fail, and I ended up losing a decent chunk of money on that. But you'll be happy to know that I did end up getting a refund for that, which is unheard of in Mexico, after I put up a good fight. So subscribe if you want to see that video. Also, stay tuned for part 2 on how I got my permanent residency 2 years later at the INM office. Many things had changed. Hasta pronto, friends. See you soon. Nos vemos.